Okay, I want to talk to you a little bit about, again, why they hate us, and I want to go into a little bit more specifics. I've done previous videos on why they hate us, and I've done this sort of compartmentalised analysis, sort of bullet pointing all of the specific reasons as to why Islam or specific subsects of Islam hate us. But I'm going to talk very as specifically as I can about wahhabism and the Sykes-Picot agreement, which is an agreement that you might not have heard of, but I guarantee you everyone in the fucking Middle East has heard about it. Or at least the people who care anyway. At least the people who are blowing themselves up at concerts in amongst children. And I know there's going to be some kind of Daily Mail reader out there, or there's probably going to be a few of you who are going to look at this and think, he's sympathising with terrorism because he's got an opinion that isn't conducive to us just wanting to hate people who aren't actually responsible. Well, I've come to the conclusion that I'm actually trying to do something quite proactive by examining motive, whereas I've also come to the conclusion that you're merely a dick. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of methodically try and analyse the reasons as to why they hate us, because I think that's a more proactive way of trying to stop it, as opposed to just shouting racial slurs at people who aren't actually responsible. So, alright, in 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist called Gavrilo Princip in the Bosnian capital Sarajevo on a diplomatic visit. This pissed the Austro-Hungarians off, and long story short, they asked their German mates whether or not they could invade Serbia. The Germans said yes, and then Kaiser Wilhelm II, the head of the German Empire, decided to fuck off on his hollybobs for 8 weeks on a boat where no one could get hold of him. In the meantime, the Austro-Hungarian Empire decided to drag their feet for fucking ages and never actually declared war. Kaiser Wilhelm II returned from his hollybobs and said, why haven't you declared war on Serbia? So an oversimplified way of describing this is to say that the Austro-Hungarians panicked, then declared war on Serbia. The Russians, who were allied with Serbia, declared war on Austro-Hungary, and the Germans got involved because the Germans were allied with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so the Germans declared war on the Russian Empire. So France consequently also declared war on the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany because they were also allied with Russia. Britain all this time was going, fuck that, and just kind of hung back for a bit until Germany invaded France through neutral Belgium, and then Britain and its empire got involved. And then we had the First World War. So, now, in November 1914, the Central Powers, which at that point only consisted of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany, were joined by the Ottoman Empire, an empire that had existed for about 600 years, but had certainly been declining for the previous 200. It got involved on the side of the Austro-Hungarians and the Germans because they weren't very fond of Russia, because they'd fought 13 wars against them in 300 years. Now, this was consequential for the British, purely because the Ottoman Empire was strategically positioned very close to the Suez Canal, which is basically its connection to the rest of the world, which prevents it from having to go all the way around the Cape of Good Hope in order to reach any of its empire, or at least much of its empire. Also, the Ottoman Empire was strategically positioned, or inconveniently strategically positioned, to Mesopotamian oil supplies for the British Empire, which basically, if severed, would have sucked the lifeblood out of any effort or any consolidated effort the British would have during the First World War. So they were important. So what the British decided to do, because they were failing terribly in places like Gallipoli and things like that, it was very difficult for them to spread the theatre from this, this trench warfare that you saw in France and Belgium into a new theatre, which was this sort of arid, inhospitable environment in the Middle East and in former Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula in general, which a lot of it was under Ottoman control, including the very religiously crucial cities of Mecca and Medina. Now, at the time, there was a uprising against the Ottomans under Prince Emir Faisal, and the British decided to tap this as a resource and decided to turn the Arabs into an asset. So they sent T.E. Lawrence over there. Maybe you might have been brought up on films like Lawrence of Arabia. That's who I'm talking about, T.E. Lawrence, this sort of eccentric Oxford-educated academic who they sent over there in order to merely liaise, really, with Prince Faisal. And what he actually eventually ended up doing was somehow magically galvanising tribal efforts against the Ottoman Empire and then leveraging them as a massive strategic contributor to the First World War, because they took the port of Aqaba, they played a massive role in taking the Syrian city of Damascus. And they did this, they assisted the British purely because of one thing, because the British promised them that after the war was ended, as soon as the Ottomans were rolled out of the Arabian Peninsula and out of the Middle East, that the British wouldn't colonise them. They promised that. They said, all right, if you help us, as soon as the Ottomans go away, we aren't just going to turn up, which was a lie. We lied to them. We literally leveraged them as a strategic asset against the Turks, predicated on a lie that we told them. Now, as early as 1915, we started agreements with the French, or discussions with the French, the other imperial power in the world, large, credible imperial power in the world, something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was signed in May 1916. You're going to see different answers to that, because it's not actually known for certain when it was actually signed, because it was a secret agreement. And it was a secret agreement for good reason, because they didn't want the fucking Arabs to find out about it, because it would piss off the entire Muslim world, which as soon as they did find out about it, as soon as it was leaked in a Russian newspaper in 1917, they were fucking right pissed off. And they had every reason to be, because what the Sykes-Picot Agreement was British and French officers drawing arbitrary lines across the Middle East, when they knew damn well that they'd promised different Arab rulers around the Middle East that after the First World War was over, that they could have a consolidated Islamic, not necessarily empire, but state. They could have self-determination for an independent, unfettered state, ranged from Syria, modern-day Syria, south towards where is now Yemen and Oman. Basically the entire Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula. And bearing in mind, this is before much of the oil in the Middle East was even discovered. Oil wasn't discovered in Saudi Arabia, for example, until 1938. Now, this destroyed the Middle East. These basically regimented lines that they drew throughout the Middle East took no account of geographical boundaries, no ethnic boundaries, religious boundaries, and as a result of this, after the First World War ended, the British and the French moved in and basically colonized the entire region. Places like Palestine, places like Lebanon, places like Jordan, places like southern and northern Iraq, places like modern-day Kuwait. Now, these were all colonised by the British and the French, basically destabilising the region and driving a wedge between the Islamic communities on purpose, in order to destabilise the religion, because prior to that, Muslims wouldn't kill Muslims. They just wouldn't do it. So the British needed to find a way of radicalising Islam for strategic and colonial benefit, all right, which is what has manifest now. A lot of the things that we tend to associate with the conflagration in the Middle East and the profligacy of human life that punctuates the Middle East, things like the Arab-Israeli crisis, the wars in Lebanon, the 6 Days War, Yom Kippur War, the 1949 war, Hezbollah, Hamas, ISIS. I mean, one of ISIS's biggest objectives, public objectives, is to overturn the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which is an agreement that you might not have even heard of, that was signed over 100 years ago. And I was on the side of this, the Arabian Peninsula was to a large degree kept unfettered by British and French encroachment, not in a traditional colonial sense. We use something called neo-colonialism, which is basically not conventional colonialism, because we don't administrate for them. But what we do instead is we leverage them in an economic fashion, and they basically become our bitch. And we did that by erecting something called the House of Saud, which is basically the Saudi royal family, which is an incredibly oppressive regime, which embraces something called wahhabism, which is a very specific, ultra-conservative, ultra-right-wing, ultra-orthodox, socio-political subsect of Sunnism, which is basically a 7th century brutal interpretation that doesn't care about killing other Muslims, which is very useful to the British, because they wanted Muslims to be killing each other. That was very strategically beneficial. It was all predicated on the concept of divide and conquer. Now, Wahhabism, this specific brutal form of Islam, which is very small, bearing in mind the population of Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia is a Wahhabi country. The population is only of about 20 million people. 5 million of those would consider themselves to be Wahhabis. This is a very small subsect of Islam, which is a religion that consists of about 1.6 billion people. But Wahhabism is responsible for ISIS. They funded ISIS. They funded al-Nusra. They funded the terrorist organizations basically all over the modern world. 15 of the 19 hijackers on 9/11, they were all from Saudi Arabia, but we declare war on all the other countries because Saudi Arabia now, post-1938, is responsible for about 30-40% of oil supplies to the rest of the world. And because they, to a large degree, geographically control the Strait of Hormuz, that means they can also, at will, shut off a lot of the other oil that is tappable by the West. They can also pump more oil into the system. Like the oil prices that we have at the moment that are really cheap, most people assume that's because we're magically finding more of the stuff. No, it's not. It's because the Saudis are perpetrating economic warfare against the rest of the world by pumping more oil into the system in order to devalue the price of oil, in order to fuck economies. Places like Iran, and we've suffered as a result of that because we're part of OPEC, the world's oil producing countries and suppliers, and the Saudis just like to play power for a little bit, so they pump loads of oil into the system, so they fuck the rest of us. The problem with terrorism, or the foundation of terrorism, not only is rooted in British tampering in Middle Eastern politics, but stems intrinsically from Saudi Arabia. So when we start invading countries like Iraq and Libya and all of these peripheral countries, it is for the purpose of making it seem as if they're doing something. They did studies on who funded terrorism, and it's Saudi Arabia, and they won't release those studies because it will fuck off the Saudis. For fuck's sake.